Order, order. We now begin our public evidence session of the Education Select Committee's inquiry on children's social care. Welcome to our session this morning. Can I first of all invite members to put on record any interest that you'd like to declare in relation to our evidence session this morning? I will start with two items that I wish to put on the record. The first is that I am a Vice President of the Local Government Association, and the second is that one of our witnesses, Matthew Horne, used to work with my husband a very long time ago in the civil service, so I put that on the record as well. Any other interests from members of the committee this morning? No.
Helen,
yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm a local councillor still.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's relevant. Thank you, Manuela. Before we get going, I'll invite our witnesses to introduce themselves in a moment. I wanted to say that this inquiry we are reopening the inquiry that the previous Select Committee had started before the general election on children's social care. We are doing so in the context of a very distressing, high-profile case, the case of the murder of Sarah Sharif, which is in the courts at the moment. We are under the sub judice rule in this session because the sentencing on that case is taking place today, and so the case has therefore not completely finished in the courts. That means that we cannot discuss any aspects of the detail of the case. As a committee, we are acutely aware of the significance of this case and other very distressing child protection cases, and the need for the social care system to respond in a preventative way to stop such tragedies from happening again in the future. And we will be taking an interest in child protection as part of this inquiry in future evidence sessions. So we may, in our questioning, touch on aspects of the wider implications of this case today. But if I can ask members and witnesses please to refrain from discussing any aspects of the detail. We'll now just ask our witnesses to introduce yourselves, if you can, starting with James at the end.
My name is James Berry. I'm Head of Policy, Research and Development at CoramBAAF, and CoramBAAF is the UK's leading membership organisation for professionals working in fostering, adoption and kinship care. 94% of local authorities are our members, as well as independent fostering providers as well.
Thank you. My name is Mark Kerr. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Children's Home Association. We are the membership body for Children's Home in England and Wales, representing local authorities, not-for-profits and for-profit providers.
Councillor Arooj, Shah, Leader of Oldham Council, but also the Chair of the Children and Young People Board at the LGA.
I'm Matthew Horne. I'm Chief Executive Innovation Unit. We're a not-for-profit, and in recent years I've worked on the Children's Social Care Innovation Programme and Strengthening Families Protecting Children programme, and my team are currently working on the Families First for Children Pathfinder programme for the Department for Education.
Thank you. Can I start with our first question, which is to ask our witnesses, can you set out the current levels of demand for children's social care and whether the current levels of provision are available to meet the need? Perhaps starting with you, Councillor Shah.
Thank you, Chair. So I think it's really well rehearsed that there has been a huge funding pressure in children's social care for local authorities. The LGA have found that 2.8 billion additional pressures over the last 5 years, which has made it really, really difficult to provide services in the way that we would have liked to, and that's due to rising costs and needs. And it's largely gone into children protection and children in care services, which is a situation that I think every local authority in the country has found themselves in, opposed to where we would have liked it to be, which is early intervention, the family work and the preventative work, because we know when you invest in those areas, you have like stability in workforce, but you also are able to have the ability to provide support for those that are most vulnerable in our communities, and that hasn't been the case. We do welcome the recent and the additional funding that the government has made into children and social care, but there is still huge concerns and huge issues and pressures that we have to address in order to make sure that we're able to provide the support that our communities need.
Thank you. I'll come to James Berry next, if that's okay.
Yeah, I would agree with those remarks. I think there is an imbalance in the system in that we have more spending at the back end of the system on children in care rather than on early intervention. Some of the challenges that we see are in terms of fostering. So there is a crisis in fostering at the moment in terms of the number of foster carers leaving the profession without actually being able to recruit sufficient foster carers to replace them. And that is a challenge, and whilst we have these high numbers of children in care, that will continue to be the case until we turn that around. I think there are some really positive developments around kinship care, and the kinship strategy has been very welcome, and we'll wait to see how those developments improve things and help keep families together. And I think it's also really important to not forget adoption in this as well. Adoption accounts for around 3,000 children per year, 3,000 adoption orders made per year. For where that is the right choice for children, that can be a hugely important permanence outcome. But fundamentally, there are real challenges with the way the system's balanced.
Mark Kerr, from the children's home perspective.
I think there's consensus the challenges that local authorities are facing on their budgets. I think there may be some debate on what the causal factors are of that, whether budgets were sufficient in the first place, about kind of wider pressures around numbers in care. Children have changed as well. The sector is currently responding to changing profiles of need, and we've got a lot of children and young people at that kind of extreme kind of end of acute high risk and high need. The research is starting to demonstrate to us that something happened through COVID and lockdowns to children, and that has created additional pressures. But I think there's challenges of whether we have the right children in the right placements. As indicated here, you know, we do have a massive problem with fostering, and I'm the first to acknowledge we have children that are in children's homes that could be better placed in foster care. And equally, that kind of the system at the higher end where there are children, the Children's Commissioner report highlighted about 750 still in unlawful placements because we cannot create the placements for them in the regulated children's home sector. And that's one of the barriers. So it's about, you know, how can we get the children that most need acute high intervention residential in that provision whilst being able to get children into foster care. Or, you know, maybe we have to look at the way that the whole system is working. I mean, we're very much focused on how the residential sector can evolve to keep families together as in a more dynamic kind of interventionist way, short-term interventions, because our principle is children should have the opportunity to live in a family life. And residential's there to help try and achieve that.
Thank you.
So in the last 10 years we've seen big increases in child poverty that have had a big effect on the children's social care system, big increase in demand, increases in extra-familial harm and increases in exploitation experienced by young people, and that has and increased recognition from the system. So all of those three things have driven demand. At the same time, we have seen increased spend in children's social care, but as colleagues have said, mainly in child protection and for looked after children, and actually cuts in early help services at a local level. So actually cutting the preventative spend has seen more than an increase in the higher cost end.
Thank you. The government set out proposals for some increased spending on social care in the autumn budget, including an additional £1.3 billion for local authorities and £250 million to pilot new approaches. What impact will this have in the context that you've all just described? Just go first, James. Yeah.
I think it will make make a difference. Whether it's going to make enough of a difference is the question. I think in trying to sort of turn around some of the sort of cuts that took place over in the sort of 2010s, and then that spending on late intervention, trying to turn that around will take some time. And that additional spending is welcome, but I don't know if it will be enough, and will it be sustained enough to make that transformation. And ultimately it is about we talked about child poverty. Child poverty has a massive impact on children, has a massive impact on families. And there's other factors that impact children. So whether it's the special educational needs system and the support for children and the support in education, there's a sort of wider support that's needed for children that's outside of just children's social care. It's about how they're supported, including things like children with neurodiversity and things like that, just to make sure that their needs are actually met. So I think it does go some way, but I'm not sure it will have to really transform children's services, it will need more money over a longer term.
Councillor Shah.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. I think really welcome it. It's fantastic. I think the way that the government is actually building on the recent sort of progress following the independent review of children's social care means that it's going to add value. Most certainly, it definitely is going to add value. And we're really, really pleased actually, because aside from the money, the government is now talking about the ongoing focus in like the early help stuff and all the stuff that we know, the early intervention and prevention stuff, and making sure that children get the right care in the right place at the right time is going to be significant. But actually, for example, in Oldham, I have a £13 million in year pressure already this year. And that whilst that money will help, there are nuances, and we are finding that there are huge pressures. So we've got mental health in our children and young people, but also in their families as well, so in their parents too. We've got the cost of living stuff. We've got the pressure on the health service as well. And I think there's so many, it's such a complex picture at the moment that we absolutely welcome the money, but I think it's going to take a hell of a lot of time and a lot of more significant investment to really have that change. And then we've got the significant challenges within the workforce as well. So to get to recruit social workers to provide that stability and care is a huge challenge itself. There's like huge campaigns across the country. In Greater Manchester, we've had to introduce a cap because we know that agency workers were getting paid a lot more than local authorities were offering them, which meant that there was a competitive nature in that. So we weren't able to provide stability in the workforce, which meant that children who had really, really vulnerable needs and complex needs were having sometimes 5, 6, 7 social workers change, which doesn't provide the support or the stability for them and their families. So there's huge issues and huge challenges, but obviously we're working in the right direction, and we really, really welcome that and really value that.
Thank you. Matthew?
I think the sector broadly welcomed the additional money. It's a lot of money, but it's nowhere near sufficient. I think one of the things that was really welcome was the reintroduction of a ring fence for that funding to ensure that it is spent on those preventative services. However, there's a real risk that as the government, central government, pour more money in using a ring fence, that other money drains out of the system locally as it is reallocated by councils to other spending pressures. So in the absence of any statutory duty for early help, it's very hard for local leaders to protect that funding to deliver preventative services for families.
Mark, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I think all of the measures are welcome. It's been quite a while coming in terms of actually the tangibles. Obviously, we'll see the bill later, but funding commitments are always welcome. But I would kind of echo that the numbers underestimate the scale of the challenge, and it's also we're going to have a period where local authorities are going to have double spending. There are preventative measures that need to be introduced at the same time as children and young people that are already on that care continuum. So it's unfortunate that we're looking at 3 to 5 years, but it's a welcome start to that journey.
And can I ask Councillor Shah, so in written evidence submitted earlier this year, the LGA highlighted the risk of councils issuing Section 114 notices in this year. Yeah. Has that risk been averted by this funding?
Definitely not. Definitely not. I think most of us are at the brink of falling off the cliff edge. Obviously trying as much as we can, but I have to, and I know I keep repeating this in every session that I do, but I have to say we have really welcomed that actually we have a government who's now talking to the sector, which is really important because it at least provides us the reassurance and comfort that somebody's actually listening, because we've been knocking on closed doors and it's been really difficult, because what you don't expect when you go back to communities, it's not for our communities to figure out local government finance. That's not their job. They expect a service from the public, from us as a public service, and we should be able to provide that, but that's been really, really difficult. But I don't think it's anywhere near, even now, to help and support councils get over this. I think it's going to take a lot, and it's going to take a longer mid-term and long-term investment to make sure that it's right. And what needs to really, really change underneath it all is the power and the tools to be able, for local authorities to be able to influence those areas as well. So there's a lot to do in so many different aspects.
Thank you. Go to Mark now for your question. Thanks.
Yes, thank you all for coming in this morning, and thanks for your answers so far. The previous Education Select Committee heard a great deal of evidence about the number of children being placed outside of their areas. So what measures should be put in place to reduce the number of out-of-area placements? And I'd like to start with Dr. Kerr, if that's okay, given that you've given evidence to this committee before.
We're the first to acknowledge there is a dislocate between where homes are needed. It's often simplified that homes are where property is cheaper, but it's genuinely a lot more complex than that. If we look, we have a concentration in the northwest of about 26-27% of the homes up there, but equally the northwest has a lot of children in care. And actually, if you look at where the children are often being placed out of their authorities, it may be from Liverpool to Manchester or Liverpool to Bolton. So there is a lot of kind of misunderstanding with that, but we need to address the barriers to opening up more specialist provision, and we need to do that very carefully, because we're not convinced, coming back to my previous answer about how many children should potentially be in foster care, how many children that should potentially be back at home, how many more children's homes we have. But we do know that we need children's homes that are able to keep safe some of the most high need and high risk children in society. They are really difficult, but we have some tangible barriers that we think that the policy paper has alluded to. Changes, tangibles, planning permission. Planning consent does create a disproportionate where children's homes are registered, because some local authorities will give what we call a certificate of lawfulness. We have about 4 or 5 examples this year. Other local authorities make you go through the full planning cycle, which can take up to 18 months. We need to look at recruitment as well, where you're able to recruit people from. And so there's a lot of factors there, but we absolutely must kind of pursue, probably with vigour. Probably the two game changer measures are the changes to location assessment with the Ofsted registration and changes to planning permission. Because what we would like to see is that providers that have evidenced an ability and competence to meet these high need, high risk children can get registered quicker, and there should be an assumption of planning consent or certificate of lawfulness being given. But by having the location assessments needing to, for your Ofsted registration, being endorsed by that local authority, puts a safety mechanism that we're getting the right homes in the right places. So there's huge opportunity in the bill, but obviously we need to see the detail and the subsequent policy papers.
Absolutely, and of course we'll see the details soon. It's open up to anyone else now who wants to contribute to this question. Yeah.
There's a couple of points I'd like to make. One is just around sort of fostering. So I've sort of made the point around the sort of crisis in fostering and the challenges around recruitment and retention in foster care. One of the challenges is around local authorities having enough in-house foster carers themselves. At the moment, the balance is almost at parity with independent fostering agencies, with about 45% of foster carers with independent fostering agencies and about 55% with local authorities. And so actually, if we want to have children placed closer to home, you probably need more local authority foster placements. Having said that, I think you also just need generally more foster carers, so there's more choice, because ultimately what's happening is that in a crisis, there isn't any in-house provision. You'll call up a independent fostering agency and find whoever is available, and that might not be nearby. So that is sort of some of the sort of sad circumstances around how placements can happen in an emergency. There's another angle as well, which is just around how the health needs of children when they're out of placement are met. And I think it's really important. It's just that the guidance is very clear about who should be delivering things in terms of health. So if you're placed out of area for universal services, that should be whatever's in that area. But if it's for secondary things like CAMS, that should be commissioned by the ICB. It's very bureaucratic, it's very difficult to achieve, and it doesn't work. And that's something that if this committee can make recommendations about looking at, there could be some national commissioning around health, because the situation doesn't work for children.
Thank you.
Matthew.
So can I just say that I think one of the big dysfunctionalities in the market is that it's highly unmanaged. There is a lot of spot purchasing of beds, often late on a Friday evening, with social workers ringing round dozens and dozens of providers to find any bed in an emergency, and in effect the local authority is a purchaser in distress. And that's a terrible situation to make long-term decisions about the care and safety of young people. So we need to create a much more managed market where there's much stronger local commissioning. We need to move away from spot purchasing of beds. We need to use planning to actually ensure that local places are for local children, and that local authorities use their planning powers to ensure that that is there. And we need to move away from buying beds to buying outcomes for children, both in the short and the long term, and seeing children's homes beds as part of a wider system that includes foster beds and kinship care, and also reunification with birth families. And really that does mean that it needs to be local. And so it would be possible to commission children's homes beds alongside other types of placements if you had this sort of long-term managed outcome-based approach.
Thank you very much.
Am I just able to pick on James' final point around the health system? And I think this is something that I feel really strongly about. And an example of that is, so for example, if you've got a young person who has significant mental health needs and needs like an inpatient bed, CAMS can easily defer responsibility, and often there is a case where they will turn around and say, well, actually, there's no diagnosable need for this young person, and just defer the responsibility, which leaves you in the situation, Matthew, that you just alluded to, where you're ringing somewhere up like on a Thursday or Friday evening and trying to get a place for this young person, because we don't, as local authorities, we can't defer responsibility. We're corporate parents, there are young people, but I just think there's something about the system and a greater call and scrutiny on the responsibilities of the health service in this, because they do sometimes escape that responsibility. I think is something that should be really, really looked at through the select committee if possible.
Thank you, Chair.
Darren.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to ask about foster care. I should probably declare an interest. I grew up in foster care, so I'm particularly interested in this. James, you've called for a foster care strategy to sit alongside the adoption and kinship care strategies. In your view, I'll begin with you, but we're really interested in others too. What should that strategy focus on? Because there were some recommendations as part of stable homes built on love. How should this go beyond that?
I think there's a number of... I think things have moved on. I think that in terms of, we've had stable homes built on love, and we've had the more recent policy paper from the government. And I think obviously the government's going down a path towards more regionalisation to try and build capacity with local authorities and to help them forecast for the future. And we'll see how that works in practice, because that's to happen. I think it's welcome, because I think ultimately the local authorities need the help, and they need to take a longer view than they have, and to get away from some of the spot purchasing that we've talked about. But from the national fostering strategy, I think it's less about a sort of framework and the sort of structure around fostering. It's more about practice and how we support foster carers better. Some of the things that foster carers are struggling with is around allegations, how allegations are handled when they're made against foster carers, and that is absolutely right that allegations are looked into and that children's needs are put first, but the majority aren't found to be substantiated, and the whole process can be extremely distressing for foster carers, for their families and for their own children. How foster carers can make decisions about children in their care, so delegated authority should be looked at. The national minimum standards should be reviewed. They haven't been reviewed since 2011. I think there's an opportunity to have harmonisation of fees and allowances, and to try and do that, try and sort that out for foster carers, because there's dissatisfaction amongst carers when they compare what they're paid across borders. And there's something about supporting the workforce, because there's too much churn in the children's social care workforce, which means that children in care have changes in social worker, but we're also seeing that in supervising social workers who support foster carers, and they need support as well. So I see it as very much a practice support, but it would also match the kinship and adoption strategies as well.
Yeah. Some of the issues there you've mentioned, particularly in terms of pay and support, are also coming through in discussions about kinship care, so perhaps there's scope to look at it together. Thank you. Some really good details there. Is there anyone else?
Yeah. For me, it's about recognising that the children that are being cared for are on a continuum, and we have foster care and we have kinship, and they will be the right place on that continuum for a child at any point in time. Really valid points there around standardisation of foster care rates, but there's also conversations happening the same in residential. There can be financial incentives for people to move fostering agencies as a kind of a golden handshake, should we say, but there are equally massive disparities now in the residential salaries. These are public services. At the end of the day, they may be outsourced, and I think we need to recognise that the sector has evolved and the government policies in some areas haven't kept abreast of that. So do we need standardised pay policies across foster care and across residential? It was mooted at a round table just last week around the people moving around children's homes, managers, etc., because registered managers' salaries have gone up by about 25-30% in the last couple of years based on supply and demand. So how can we remove that financial incentive to move around and recognise that should we be looking at children's social care as a similar public service sector as any other, and introduce pay banding?
Just one follow-up around the latest DFE paper that does mention, I think, James, you said this, the move towards more regional recruitment hubs. What impact is that likely to have? Is that a silver bullet?
I think it could have a potentially, a very useful impact, because local authorities operate at a time where they're focusing on child protection, children in their care, and meeting this need, and actually being able to have at a regional level an opportunity to take a step back, look at their sufficiency, and the regional care cooperatives that have been set up in Manchester and in the South East have got some additional funding, so they may be able to put some provision in place. So because it is matched with funding, they may be able to improve their sufficiency. I suppose if it is rolled out across the country, more regional care cooperatives, and I think it'd be important they are funded. I think there is a challenge in that there are a limited pool of people to become foster carers, and so trying to expand that is a challenge. You could have a national recruitment campaign which could try and increase that pool, but I think it will remain to be seen. But I think there is something in trying to prevent local authorities competing both with other local authorities and with independent fostering agencies, and to sort of work more collaboratively that could actually make better decision making and planning for children in care.
Jess.
Just briefly on that, do you think there's an issue that the national fostering recruitment that's been devolved to regional levels hasn't sufficiently involved independent fostering agencies as part of a collaborative partnership to ensure that we are reaching as many foster carers as possible?
I think when you speak to independent fostering agencies, it is challenging, because ultimately it can feel like competition between local authorities and independent fostering agencies, even though you're providing a service to those local authorities, because ultimately you're fishing in the same pool for the same people. Having said that, there is a lot to be learnt from independent fostering agencies. They do very good work. I think 96% are rated outstanding or good, and they do very good work in what they do in terms of, and they focus on one thing, which is recruitment and retention of foster carers and providing those good placements. But I also think independent fostering agencies could learn from local authorities. So I think there is an opportunity there. I don't think we've missed it totally yet, and we have local authorities and IFAs in our membership, and I think there is an opportunity to learn. We've been working on the FostLink project about improving recruitment and approval processes with the Department for Education and Mott MacDonald, and again there's learning from that which would be relevant across the board, so I think there is an opportunity.
I'll just come in on that. I spent many years sitting on fostering panels, and still I've got a large set of colleagues in the fostering sector, but I think that I'm nervous about the regionalisations being held up as the solution in so many different areas. Results have been mixed, particularly around regional commissioning, and I know that one or two foster agencies I know exceptionally well in terms of their growth and their satisfaction among their carers. Their marketing or recruitment comes from word of mouth. And so I think that there is in certain areas there's that real need for a local approach when you're looking to find local people, and you're trying to, on the one hand we're saying we want to try and keep children in their local communities, but on the other hand we're saying a regional approach would be the solution. I don't know if we can reconcile those, and whilst there are some huge opportunities when we're working on both the regional care cooperatives with the local authorities for creating provision for high need, high risk cohorts, that there's not many of them, but a regional approach there. But I think for everyday children's social care, foster placements, local children's homes, I think it needs to stay with local authorities in terms of local accountability and just having that community around them.
Anybody else want to come in? No. Okay, in which case we'll go to Manuela for your question.
Thank you, Chair. Focusing on kinship care and arrangements, James, the Department for Education's policy paper set out a number of measures to support kinship carers, including trialling and kinship allowance, and also appointing a national kinship care ambassador. What are your views on these measures, and are any further measures needed?
I think that the kinship strategy was really welcome. It's the first ever national kinship strategy. And I think for a lot of kinship carers and children in kinship care arrangements, just to feel seen and recognised by the government was really important. In terms of I think it's really positive that this government has taken forward some of the work that was started under the previous government and sort of continued that. I think there's the proposals around family group decision making. They sound about having those opportunities to have a family group decision making or family network meeting at the point where the child is potentially on the edge of care, and so that the family can make decisions is really important. It's not necessarily new. That is sort of practice that has happened in the past, and I suppose it's standardising that. It's making sure that the guidance and support for social workers delivering that works for the family. I think, and I'd say the National Kinship Ambassador, Janine Davis, is a really great appointment as well. There are racial disparities in kinship care, kinship children, there's black and ethnic minority children are overrepresented in kinship care, but are overrepresented in areas where there is less support. So, for example, you're less likely to be under a special guardianship order where there's more support, or less likely to be in a kinship foster care arrangement if you're a black or minority ethnic child. I think what I would say is that there is room for improvement. We have, my colleague calls it a square peg in a round hole. We have a growing cohort of kinship foster carers, which makes up nearly a quarter of foster carers now, and they're being fitted into a framework which was designed for unrelated foster carers, and they're doing that largely because the children get more support because their child's in care, and the foster carers get more support and some financial support because they get paid at the level of foster carers. That they don't necessarily fit very well into that framework, and we're sort of trying to squeeze the two together, and the Law Commission will be looking at that next year, and I think it would be something to try and unpick and unravel because it doesn't quite work. You have fostering panels looking at kinship carers, and how that feels for kinship carers doesn't quite work. So I think there's more work to be done, but it's been good work so far.
If I could just yeah, so I think and agree entirely, welcome all the work and the strategy around kinship carers, but I think that works really well, and we discuss a lot about the kinship carer arrangements for children and families that are in formal kinship arrangements, but actually there's a significant proportion of people that are in informal kinship arrangements, so like extended family or whatever, and I think there needs to be more conversation around how we can support them as well, and they do tend to be from like racially minoritized communities, because it's just a natural way of how people do things, so it's the support's not there for them in the same way, and I think we need to like bring into that strategy the informal sort of arrangements for kinship carers.
If I can come, I mean, you get this sort of perverse situation whereby the families who potentially need the most amount of support get the arrangement with the least amount of support, because they don't quite meet the level to be able to qualify as a foster carer. There's too many concerns around them to actually get them to meet regulations, so they might end up, the child might be put under a child arrangement order or in a private fostering arrangement, because that is actually the only way that they can make it work, and then they have less support.
So I was talking recently with colleagues in North Yorkshire County Council on this question about kinship care and family networks. I think it's easy for the government to try and legislate around structures and processes, but probably what is more important is a stronger focus on practice and how the whole workforce works, particularly with birth families and their extended family and kinship networks. In North Yorkshire's use of family finding and family seeing as part of their safeguarding practice is really strong, and they would argue that actually this whole approach to working with kinship networks needs to run all the way through all of their social work practice, from early help onwards, and that although the evidence on family group conferencing and family group decision making is strong, and the work of the family rights group on family group conferencing is sort of sets the gold standard, it's more than just mandating certain structures at certain points in the legal process, and actually what we need to see is a sort of change in practice throughout the whole of the safeguarding system.
Thank you. We will go to Caroline now.
Thank you, Chair. So I'd like to move on to ask James a question about adoption. So the previous government launched its national adoption strategy in 2021. What impact do you think this had on adoption provision, and what measures would you like to see from the new government to build on this?
Thank you. Yeah, it's the national adoption strategy is now coming up to about 4 years on. I think there are some real challenges around adoption which aren't necessarily related to practice, and it's to do with demographics, and it's to do with systemic challenges in terms of, say, cost of living and where we can recruit adopters from. But what I would say is I think it is worth potentially reviewing the implementation of the national adoption strategy now we're 4 years on, and look at areas where we could improve. I think there are still significant challenges in finding adopters and finding homes for children who are the hardest to place. And those tend to be children who are older than the age of 5, children with disabilities, children from black and minority ethnic backgrounds. And that has been the case. That was the case back in 2021, and it was the case back in the 2010s. And we haven't managed to resolve that. And I think going back and having a look at that again in detail and coming up with some real tangible actions would be helpful. CoramBAAF are part of Coram. Coram used to run the National Adoption Register, which was closed down in 2018. And I think Coram would argue that reopening the National Adoption Register, which would encourage matching on a national basis, would be something that would help in that space. There is already Link Maker there, so you'd have to work out how that would fit alongside that. But those are some things. I think there's also just something about the workforce. We've moved regional adoption agencies are now the sort of main delivery model for adoption. and we're losing practice in local authorities around adoption. So actually, if we want to really improve adoption practice, we need to sort of bring that adoption expertise back into local authorities in some way as well, because we've lost some of that expertise. They've gone to the regional adoption agencies, and so we're losing that pathway through. And I think that would be really important. And finally, I think there's something really important about access to records. It's sort of later on, but we need to review the regulations that are in place around access to records, particularly for those children who are adopted after 2005, the post-commencement children, because the regulations don't work when we've looked at them in detail. And I'd say the other thing is that we just need to update the regulation and the guidance. The regulation was written in 2005, the guidance was in 2013. The regulations don't mention regional adoption agencies at all. So, and the adoption regulations aren't written with the existence of looked after children's health assessments as part of them either. So there's a lot of updating that could be done as well.
Just very, very quickly, could I ask you whether you think there's enough support offered to adoptive families post-adoption, or is that geographically varied?
Yeah, I think that's one of the significant challenges in actual recruiting adopters. I think you'll find that, because it's difficult anyway, but I think you'll find that I agree a lot of it has to do with the cost of living, but a lot of it has to do with access to support. And I think we have to be able to give, and you've got now as a result like young people waiting a long time to meet their new families, and it is because we have to be able to give adopters the confidence that they will receive ongoing support at any point in that child's life, and that's something that we're not able to do now. And I think that's where we need to, and if we're able to provide that support, I think the recruitment of adopters will become easier too. It's because we can't offer that long-term support and access to it, and that's something that we should be able to say with confidence to them.
Thank you.
There's this modernisation of adoption and increasing openness in adoption, which has been put forward in the Public Law Working Group, and I think it's welcome, where there's like to be more contact between a child and the birth parents, and that sort of be presumed as sort of normal in adoption, where it's appropriate for that child, and that's what's in their best interest. There will need to be training for social workers about how to do that. There will need to be support for adopters about how to do that. There'll also need to be support for birth parents around how to do that. And there isn't enough support for birth parents currently as well, who often have experienced huge amounts of trauma and loss in the process.
Amanda.
Thank you. We've sort of talked around it this morning around the government's stated aim of supporting children in kinship care and in foster homes. However, not all children are able to enter those. It's not always the best way. So often residential care is seen as, and we've heard in a committee report here, as the last resort. So I'd like to ask you a few questions around residential care. It's to all of you. So firstly, do you agree with the approach that we should be looking to put kids with foster carers and with kinship care? If that's not the answer, what are your views on residential care being the last resort, and what measures should we be taking to improve residential care?
I think there needs to be a flexible model of care that should be available for people, because I think, this whole reference to residential care being the last resort, you often find that lots of people, especially young people, because of the experiences they've had with their own families, don't actually want to go and live in a family setting anymore. And actually the residential sort of care element of it provides them with the sort of reassurance and the comfort that they need. And I think there has to be some flexibility around that. I think we should also make sure that opposed to the current models that we offer, because the current model does offer limited support as well, especially to families through significant crises, with binary options being either you're in care or you're out of care. And I think having a more flexible model will then provide that sort of particular support for teenagers, especially, because that's where I think I see it a lot. And it provides that important breathing space that they need to be able to live their lives in a fulfilled way. We're seeing it a lot with actually unaccompanied asylum seeker children, where there's been trauma, and then you're then trying to place them with families, and actually the families aren't equipped with the right kind of support to provide to them, which means that we're adding to the trauma. And we've found that where we've then been able to provide them with the residential care support, which is what they want, we're actually breaking down those really difficult barriers of behaviour and stuff like that. So I think a flexible approach and a model should be something that we're more comfortable in approaching.
I'll come in that. Yes, I mean, it's been a phrase around for a long time. I did my PhD in this space, and we can go back to the Curtis Committee review in the late 1940s about this foster versus residential debate. And it's kind of, over the years, it's some of it's ideological, some of it's based on cost. But the evidence is unequivocal. Actually front-loading residential for some children and young people can give them a much better journey through care. But back to the local authority budget situation, the reality is there is a significant cost difference between the two, and whilst even on the surface of it may be really clear that a child should be starting a much higher need kind of care setting, the financial decision making is driving what local authorities are having to do, and that's understandable. But it's recognising that that we can't look at them as silos, and it's a bit looking at the health journey. For example, I find that children's social care is seems to be perceived as operating in this bubble away from the rest of health and social care. If we look at an individual's journey through a hospital, I mean, children's residential is at the acute end. I mean, some of these children are potential serious walking, talking, serious case reviews. The level of risk is huge for these kids. And so often it's expensive, but what we ideally want is a child to start in that kind of acute high need provision and then move down that continuum in a controlled way, and then hopefully have a long lasting placement. Or permanency has been lost a lot in those who've been around the sector for a long time. We've lost sense of the concepts of permanency. What's the placement, what's the outcome for this child that we want? And it may be a child that's in the acute end in a very high need, restrictive setting, but we still want the outcomes for them to be in a family environment, and those journeys are not really thought about enough at the moment.
Thank you.
So I'm greatly influenced by the No Wrong Door innovation in children's homes that was set up in North Yorkshire and now operating in a number of local authorities. Following on from what Mark has said, the goal there of their children's homes is to ensure that all young people achieve permanency in a family setting, and that could be a foster setting or kinship care or indeed reunification with the birth family. And so in that sense, a children's home should never be a last resort. It should never be a destination. It should only really be a stepping stone to permanency in a family setting, because that really is the only way in which you can deliver the longer term outcomes that we want, which is preparation for adulthood, preparation for parenthood, and living in a normal family setting. A lot of young people will say they would prefer to live in a children's home, but that's largely because we've treated them so badly in their preceding experiences of the system. So I think so long as we focus on what those big long-term outcomes are, children's homes should be a stepping stone towards permanency in a family setting.
Thank you. Just if I can just come back, just one more thing around that. So obviously understanding the language, the flexibility, the need for a path and a route map, for want of a better word. But just touching on one thing, what could we do to improve residential care as it is?
I mean, a lot of it is around the language. At the moment, it's become extremely toxic. Figures and statistics, there's been a theme of them being misrepresented, which we do have to challenge. So, for example, the not recognising that it's a very diverse sector, the residential care sector. I mean, we made the decision, well, the first decision I took as CEO when I started, when I went from deputy in April, was to change our membership criteria, and you can no longer be a member of the Children's Home Association if you're based in a tax haven or receive funding from tax havens. As an indication that the government may be kind of exploring that lead. But we have a sector that's evolved over 30 plus years, and to improve it is going to take a concerted effort, but it also needs respecting. And whilst that there is this level of toxicity of language in Parliament, misrepresenting, so the CMA, for example, only looked at the largest 15 providers in the country out of 900. But the figures that were from that report has then kind of extrapolated and said the whole sector is profiteering. And the problem is with this is that up and down the country are some really resilient, committed practitioners in these children's homes doing an amazing job under really difficult circumstances. I think we've forgotten the workforce in this, and it's this kind of homogenous blob of profiteering children's homes, when that is genuinely not the reality for most of the 950 odd providers of residential care. So I think the government needs to kind of at least acknowledge and respect that diversity and much clearer. I mean, even when the policy announcements were made. And then we do a lot of work, there's really, really good work with civil servants at the moment, developing this community secure provision. There's significant improvements in scope. But sometimes every now and again there's a bit of a disconnect at the political level, and a random figure is profit caps, and this is not defending any kind of profit or not. We're a broad church, but to pluck a figure of 8.8%, that's put better confidence in the sector at the same time as they want the sector to invest heavily, because the reality is local authorities don't have the funding, so the money does have to come, some of it from the independent sector. The government's 40 odd million, whilst welcome, very restricted to capital again, so bricks and mortar, when the capital in the children's homes are the people. So I think just a better recognition at the political level of the challenges associated with residential care.
Thank you.
I'm going to move on to Serena's question.
That is Matthew did have.
Oh, sorry.
So I just wanted to add that in terms of what else can we do to improve children's homes, No Wrong Deal children's homes have attached to them foster placements and supported lodgings placements and supported accommodation and other types of placement that enable young people to move through. But it's the same team, the same staff and the same relationships that support them through those different placements. A strong focus on practice and a restorative practice model. And they are part of a local system that also means that those homes can provide they have some spare capacity, they have some emergency beds. And it is the lack of emergency beds in the system that means that you end up making very bad long-term choices, because there is no local space to accommodate young people in an emergency. So those children's homes tend to be quite expensive, they tend to be well staffed, but they're often supporting dozens of young people who are not resident in the children's home. They're doing edge of care work and they're supporting children in other placements as well. So seeing the children's home as part of a local system is really important, and that all of that needs commissioning. And again, that comes back to my point, you can't achieve that through spot purchasing beds.
Thank you. Move on to Serena.
Okay, thank you, Chair. My question actually follows on quite well from what Dr. Kerr was just referring to, about not being distracted by the few that are profiteering. But my question is based on that because of the impact that it's having across the country. So, based on the evidence of high profits being made by the largest 20 private sector providers of children's residential care that made over £300 million of profit in 2023. At the same time, over the last 5 years, we have seen the number of places that are costing more than £10,000 a week rising by something like a 12-fold increase. So the government has recently set out a number of proposals to reform the social care market, such as a new financial oversight regime and a possible cap on profits. So what impact do you think that this will have on provision and the quality of children's social care? Because in too many occasions, provision and quality is not meeting expectations. So I'd like to go back to Dr. Kerr with that, please.
There's a risk, I think, that, as I announced, as I kind of said at the policy announcements in the House a couple of weeks ago, very much focused on residential, as has other reports, but ignoring the margins made by foster care were similar, and actually supported lodgings and semi-independent provision was about 30-35%, significantly higher. So there's this political kind of target of residential. Every time we've had an extreme high-cost outlier, 10, 20, 30, 40, £50,000 a week, We've never been able to track it back to a regulated children's home. They've generally been in an unlawful, unregulated, unregistered placements, which the government is now tackled, and Ofsted are working their way through. But we still have 750-ish children based on the Children's Commissioner's data. But in certain cases, they're not profiteering either. The most expensive placement that I'm in contact with at the moment is actually a local authority young lady, and it's costing £3 million a week. A year, sorry, not a week. £3 million a year. But that's in a local authority placement. Some of these children have really high need and high risk profiles. So what I'm worried about is that we have the majority of the sector, including Action for Children, Bernardo's, we're a broad church, that the small SME micro providers that we are relying on, those are the ones that we need to expand, that are making much smaller margins. They don't have the economies of scale. The market oversight and most of the focus of government in this area is targeted at the very large ones, and most of those are based offshore. So there is a risk that it will push them further offshore. The more scrutiny, if you put unfortunately with these large multi-billion-pound corporations, if you put some sort of cap, they will find a way of gaming it, and it will be your smaller SME micro providers that actually struggle because they don't have ways or international corporate structures that allows them to avoid that cap. Because it's also ignored that a lot of the time the system spillage or leakage of money is around the interest rate on loans. It's not actually and we speak to civil servants all the time with this, is the money is being lent from tax havens at a very high interest rate. And that's nothing to do with profit, and some of these companies are not actually making a profit. So all we would ask is that the government monitors the unintended consequences and whether or not any measures of fixing interest rates or fees will have the outcome that they want on the companies that they want to.
Okay, so I hear from you that you would welcome the new requirement that any new provider wishing to enter the market must be owned and domiciled in the UK.
The Children's Home Association believes in a mixed economy of care, but I, when I took over the leadership, working closely with the board and our members, we believe that general taxation pays for children's social care. And what I care about is a mixed economy that delivers social value. And for me, page one of social value is that you are subject to the tax system in the country that you receive these monies from for public services.
Thank you. Can I go to Councillor Shah?
Just you wanted to come in specifically on that.
Just very quickly, there was a research paper from the University of Oxford that looked at Ofsted outcomes for for-profit and not-for-profit residential homes, which seemed to suggest that outcomes were poorer for children in for-profit homes, and I just wonder whether you could comment on that.
Yes. As somebody that was previously immersed in research, we've been quite disappointed with some of the papers, I'll be honest, in terms of the framing of it. It's quite surprised that it's a strong ideological kind of taste of flavour comes through some of the papers. But there's been a couple of papers. One, they looked at historic Ofsted data, where there were disparities between the independent sector provision and local authority provision and charitable. But there is also, we do know that the more higher need, higher risk kids are in the independent sector. But there's also historical Ofsted data. Now, if you look at the current data, we're pretty much in line, local authority, the independent sector. So why we're looking at several years ago data, I'm interested in today, and there's not really any difference in quality between the sectors at the moment. But one of the most recent papers was on number of notifications that a children's home makes, and that's mandatory communications to Ofsted and LADO, and that's what keeps children safe. So it's really important that they remain. But I think that the research paper and the subsequent media headlines were that 90% of the 90% of the children's homes that have been subject to notifications, a high number of compliances, were in the independent sector. But that's in line with the proportion of the independent sector anyway. So it was a kind of a non-statistic. So again, we just urge that the debate and the rhetoric around this is firmly based on evidence of the problems that we face today, not the problems from 5 years ago.
We are running really short on time at this point. Will affect the time we have for the second panel. So if witnesses could keep your contributions. Brief, can I ask for any further contributions on this issue from a different perspective?
I'd like to hear Councillor Shah's perspective.
Yeah,
please.
so in principle, the cap in profits really welcome it. The LGA hasn't got an informed view, but I can certainly say we've long called for measures to tackle this, and I think it's really distasteful that people do make enormous profits of some of our most vulnerable children. I'm just really pleased that they're going to look into this, because I think it is a huge challenge and an issue.
Yeah, so the economic regulation of these providers and the inspection of all places is a mess and ineffective, and the whole thing needs reform. We have a lot of inspection based on the behaviour of children during the inspection and the judgments linked to that, which creates a lot of problems. Some of these very high cost places are not because they're a very high risk, high need children. It's because there's often one child in a children's home that has 6 places in it, and all the other children have been removed. That makes it a very expensive place, but that's not really what the care plan is requiring. So the whole thing, I think, is dysfunctional, and the use of debt and loans and profiteering, I think, is indefensible. And so I think the more that the government, I actually don't think Ofsted has the capabilities to provide the economic regulation needed, and the model of inspection is out of date.
Thank you. I'll go to Patrick now.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm going to ask some questions about regional care cooperatives, and I want to jump quickly. From the evidence you've given, it seems that most of you are in favour of the regionalisation of purchasing of residential placements. Just quick, correct, incorrect? Has anyone got a problem with the
I think with the regional care, I know the fostering regional cooperatives have worked really well. I think we're going to need about a year to see how these work, but I think the principle of them is fine and completely in support.
And that's where what I want to ask a question on is the application and the rollout. Twofold. Why haven't local authorities begun doing this organically already? And what are the problems you foresee getting local authorities to work together? My experience is whenever the Department for Education or anyone in Whitehall tries to tell local authorities what to do, it comes with certain problems. So any just off-the-cuff evidence you can provide on what your advice would be in rolling this out nationally?
I think collaboration is what we need. So again, welcome that. I don't foresee any issues. We're going to have to see how these roll out to see whether they work or not. But I think in principle, fine. I can't see an issue with it at all.
For me, on the residential, just touching the same as the fostering, I think it's the higher need, the more complex children, where we can get the most benefits from. I still think that there's a disconnect with local accountability and keeping children local when you're going to pool your budgets. I don't know how that fits with kind of really locally based accountability and decision making.
And I'll just say, I support the regional care cooperatives. I think the local authorities do work together quite a lot, but this is a way of formalising that. One thing that they should do is learn from the establishment of the regional adoption agencies. There are about 5 different models of regional adoption agencies with different sort of hub and spoke models that make standardising practice sometimes a bit more complicated than it could be. So if we're going to create these regional care cooperatives, let's not try and create lots of different types of them, so that then it's hard to sort of improve practice nationally.
A more organic and collaborative and networked approach normally is more effective than one designed in Whitehall.
Just finally, in light of the extensive coverage of the appalling murder of Sarah Sharif, I just wanted to invite, without talking about the specific case, any comments that you would like to make on current failures in child protection and reforms that are needed in order to deliver the level of change that can stop future tragedies of this type from happening again. And you might want to do that with, or you might not, but you might want to do that with specific reference to the government's announcement that we've seen today about the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill, restrictions on homeschooling, for example, for children who are subject to child protection proceedings, and measures of that nature, but I just wanted to, before we get to the end of this session, to invite any comments that you'd like to make on the potential strengthening of child protection. Matthew.
So the evidence on multi-agency approaches to family help is strong. The evidence in relation to child protection is not, to my mind, not so strong. But any duties that local authorities want to place on local authorities to create multi-agency teams, they must also place on health and on the police. Simply to place all the duties on the local authorities will not solve the problem. So yeah, and finally I would add that the most important thing is that we focus on the practice of the staff in those multi-agency teams and the quality of the practice that they use consistently, and focus less on some of the structures that have been discussed.
I think the register that the Secretary of Education announced today is like hugely welcome. I think it gives us local authorities the levers to go in and also meet with people and to exclude them from home education is going to be really vital, because we saw that they were the instances that led to that today, and really welcome the announcements that the Secretary of State has made today. But I think with that we need to add the tools and the ability to have face-to-face contact with children on child protection orders as well, to strengthen the announcements that have been made today, because otherwise it's one case too many. I think horrific.
I think it's quite important that we acknowledge that, obviously from the South Residential Care, we're at that upper end of the care continuum. If we go down that care continuum, we've talked about the consequences of things wrong at the front door. That's how we've ended up in the situation with as many kids as we do in care. So I think that we need to kind of look at that, and that involves child protection. It does involve looking at social work. Does there need to be a reset there? There seems to be obviously a lot of talk in the sector around a chief social worker without a timeline. Do we need to have a fresh look at the preventative measures much earlier on?
I'll just come in and just, I think it's sort of, if the key message when I looked at some of the evidence sessions from previous sessions, it's about trying to rebalance so we have much more preventative measures early on rather than dealing with the back end where we've got children in care and we're spending all our money there. I think the point that Matthew made around keeping children safe is about practice, and I think it is if a safer practitioner with proper supervision and with the support of managers and stable colleagues makes a big difference, and that helps keep children safe. The one thing I would say is that with the single unique identifier which has been identified, it's worth looking at how that might work in relation to adoption and how that NHS record can travel with the child. It's really important for the child's record to travel with them, and there's a piece of work to be done there. And the other thing is just guidance for social workers about how, when children are homeschooled and there's child protection concerns, social workers will need guidance about how to apply that, and what happens if a parent says, I'm not going to do that. What happens next?
Thank you very much. Can I thank all four of our witnesses on our first panel for coming to give your evidence this morning. Can we pause the broadcast briefly while we swap over our witnesses for the second panel? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
We've interviewed Councillor Shah and Harriet.
Yeah.
I'm not alone.
No, I don't think we are.
No.
I'm worried I might infect Caroline though.
Dear, I've literally just got rid of one.
I might have got it from you actually. I was with you last week, wasn't I?
Oh dear, Mark.
Sorry, I just...
You want to swap it?
Yeah. You did the sneezing first. Was it you earlier?
Yeah. Good. Lovely. Order. We'll resume our public proceedings of this Education Select Committee evidence session on children's social care. Thank you to our witnesses for coming to give your evidence to us this morning. Can I just first of all make the same announcement that I did at the start of our first evidence session, just in relation to the appalling murder of Sarah Sharif, and just to ask everybody to note that because the sentencing hearing in that case has not yet concluded, it may conclude while we're sitting this morning. It's due to take place today, but it hasn't yet concluded. We are subject to the sub judice rules, which means that we cannot discuss any of the details of that case this morning. So can I ask you to stick within those parameters? Welcome you here this morning. Can I ask each of our witnesses, first of all, to introduce yourselves, starting with Maris?
Hello, my name is Maris Stratulis, and I'm the National Director of the British Association of Social Workers in England. I'm a registered social worker. We have a membership of over 22,000 members from across the sector, including education, social workers in children's services, adult services, health, palliative care, just as an example. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, I'm Harriet Edwards, Head of Policy, Public Affairs and Research from SENSE National Disability Charity. Also here today representing the Disabled Children's Partnership, which is a coalition of more than 110 organisations, including parent carers, of which we're a member. And representing myself, I'm also a parent carer to a 5-year-old with cerebral palsy.
Hi, my name is Jo Harrison. I'm co-chair and director of the National Network of Parent Carer Forums. We have a membership of over 156,000 via the 153 parent carer forums that make up across England. I'm a parent carer and myself, and I'm here to represent the views of our membership today.
Thank you, Katharine. Good morning. My name is Katharine Sachs-Jones. I'm the Chief Executive of Become, and we are the national charity for children in care and young care leavers.
Thank you very much. We're going to start with some questions on disabled children's care. So I'm going to ask the first question, which is particularly for Harriet and for Jo, if that's okay. And I'd like to ask you, is the level of provision for disabled children's social care adequate? And how easy or not, as the case may be, is it for parents to access support?
Quite simply, it's not good enough, and time and time again, disabled children have been overlooked by the social care system. A recent report from Disabled Children's Partnership found that 1 in 5 families are not getting the support they need for their child to reach their full potential, and 1 in 7 said they're just not getting that correct level of social care support either. And as has been discussed, demand is rising in the system, there's a lot of tensions, but what happens time and again is that disabled children and their families get treated with suspicion, with shame, and with a safeguarding lens rather than support from the very start. So from that sense, we're hearing this a lot with our families as well, and there's been a real increase in the complexity of needs, and often when people are reaching us, they're often in crisis at that point too. That early intervention just hasn't been there. They're often on their knees, and respite support is rarely available where they live as well.
Agreeing with Harriet, I think many of our parents report that they are viewed through a safeguarding lens rather than looking at a person-centred views. Many parents fear that they are blamed and fear social care engagement for fear of child removal. Insufficient carers assessments are repeatedly reported, and the barriers to access is harsh. I think parents and carers often express a huge level of concern around the training of social care, with that lack of understanding around the difficulties that face children and young people with SEND, particularly the impact that then has on the rest of the family and siblings in particular as well. I think that the safeguarding over the needs lens is huge, and I think that adding an inconsistency of practice from social workers and social care, that we're only seeing that really good practice when people are going above and beyond rather than it being a standard practice. And I think as well, when we're looking at access, the criteria is often not transparent. It's often a postcode lottery depending on where you live as to what accesses you can get. And that causes a lot of frustration. You can access a service in one area, you can't access it in another, and there is little transparency over those provisions. And things, if you're getting sort of personal budgets, you can't get the carers to fulfil those. So generally it's quite difficult for families. So there's a real lack of trust in the system, I think.
Thank you very much. I'll go to Manuela next for your question.
So, and this is a question to Harriet and Joe as well. So the previous committee heard evidence that parents are struggling to access and use personal budgets. So what changes need to be made in your views to ensure these personal budgets work effectively?
Well, in principle, personal budgets are great, and personalisation, we can all welcome that children's needs should be at the centre of the money that's there. But in reality, that's just not what we've seen on the ground. So lots of families really struggling to manage that money. It's an extra pressure on themselves. I think understanding living with a disabled child, your to-do list is very long. It adds often adding on something that someone has to deal with. Then it comes to employment and the workforce challenges. Many families can't get the staff they need to fill these budgets. So lots of research has shown that. And also it's the small packets of funding as well. So how are you going to get someone 2 hours every morning to support your child if that's all that you've been granted? It's really very challenging in practice.
I think we agree. I think this comprehensive reform is needed to simplify the process for parents and carers. And whilst we would say, obviously, as anyone, to look at increasing the funding, because as we've said, if you're going to get access for 2 hours a week at some point, how are you supposed to employ somebody for those 2 hours? And I think there's quite an administrative burden for parents. Obviously, they've got to look for the members of staff to fulfil their roles. They effectively then become employers to some of those people. There is really strict rules around the usage of that funding, and often if you can't use the funding, you then have to give it back. So quite a lot of people don't even try to get the funding because the administrative burden of it is too high, and that can obviously impact the whole family. So I think really for us, the process needs to be simpler. There needs to be more trust and equity in the ability to use that funding and to be more creative. But I think it also links into poor commissioning of local services. If we don't commission the services for people to buy into, how are we supposed to use the funding appropriately?
Thank you. Maris.
I'd absolutely agree. Access needs to be a lot smoother, and the thresholds in many local authorities have increased. I primarily believe that is about the financial pressures and the legacy of deficits and budget restraints, and I think it's really hard for parents and carers accessing that support. I'd also just like to go back to the earlier point that I think there is some fantastic social work out there in the community as well, and I think it's really important that we celebrate the good aspects of social work. And I know of many families from a child in need perspective that have been able to access support and services, not just from social workers, but also from social care practitioners. So I think it's really important that we keep a lens on the good aspects of social work as well. But I absolutely agree in terms of the training and the support as well, that social workers, there needs to be an investment in continuous professional development across the board, and that does include CPD and learning and training and development in terms of children's disability and adult disability. We're one profession, and we should not just see children in isolation. They are part of really integral, important families and communities that support them within their life. Thank you.
Good to Montana.
Thank you. And again, this is mainly for Harriet and Joe, but obviously if others wanted to come in, please do. We've heard from previous committees and concerns, and actually some of you, around the lack of multi-agency working around disabled children's care. So I've got a question around sort of 3 areas of that really. What should be done to ensure that education, health and social care work together? What are your views on the Laws Commission's proposals on improving assessment for disabled children? And finally, one that's slightly different, should there be clearer separation between disabled children's care and the rest of social care? And if yes, how would that work in practice? So sorry, it's quite long, but you'll probably cover all of those in your answers.
No, that's fine. I think the issue of looking at social care and looking at whether that should be an integrated or a separate service. And I've touched, speaking to some of our members this week, around this, and I think a lot of parents do advocate for a separate service, and people are doing so because they feel that would avoid that safeguarding lens, because you would have people that fully understand the needs of the children and the young people and the dynamic of the family, and feel that having a separate service would provide that consistent and clearer support, and having that person-centred approach. But that said, having a separate service, you would need to be very clear around the responsibilities, as to how that would sit. And I think as you move through to adult social care, I think you need to ensure that transition is clear. It would need to be transparent and seamless as the children grow older, because we know often the transition is that real cliff edge for many of our young people. But I think that if the other side of it is you did have a fully integrated service, you've got a one-stop shop, for want of a better word. And I suppose in that perspective it would be financially beneficial for the government. But I think that it would come with some concerns that you're not going to you'd have to train the whole workforce to a specific level, and how are you going to ensure that you've got that relevant CPD practice and growing and knowledge and understanding, because it does rely, as we've said, there is some great practice, but it does often rely on those going above and beyond. And if you're wanting to move away from that, you need to ensure that the whole workforce is trained to a standard.
I'd absolutely echo all Jo has said. I think for us, the key points, the transition stage into adulthood is really key, especially to echo government's other ambitions around getting Britain working. Like, these are the key things that are going to help disabled young people into work. You have to have high quality social care to do that. And at the moment, there's just a cliff edge in that support. The other point for us really that to emphasise with the multi-agency side is the early intervention opportunities here. If we can really reach families at those first stages of diagnosis, in the neonatal units, when they're coming out into the community, working with health visitors, it has to be across those community support as well. So it's not just in social care, it's across the community. In health has been mentioned a lot as well, but we know health is some of those early contact moments that children may they're just not being signposted at that point to social care. So in principle, that single assessment process could be really, really helpful. At the moment, parents just juggling multiple appointments. I can't even tell you, I think I had maybe 300 in last year before my son started school, and that's working full time on top of that, and it's just not feasible unless you've got a really flexible employer, and you've got family support locally as well. So I'm lucky in that sense, but so many families are not. And the other thing I just emphasise as well is the disparities here, and the way the system is just increasing that inequality at the moment. So the recent report from the Disabled Children's Partnership focused on Black and Asian families and found that this was even more entrenched, and those feelings of shame and suspicion as well are very different for the different ethnic biases that are applied as well.
Thank you. You asked regarding how education can fit into that model, and I think that parents and carers will often feel, and I'm sure my colleagues will agree, that there is a lack of coordination between social care and education and health, and we need to be bringing those together to have better multi-agency working. And in particular, I think we've got some statutory processes and non-statutory processes around support for children and young people, and we don't see social care at times engaging, whether that's capacity, knowledge, understanding, or in things like the EHCP process, providing really good quality advice and support, annual reviews, but also that is for the more complex children. But we don't see social care engaging where children and young people are on the having graduated approach support, send support in school, that ordinary available provision. It's really difficult to get any form of universal advice, support, or have that social care interaction, even if it is to signpost and give quality information around short breaks, respite, and things that families can access on a universal level.
Just add as well. I've got Maris and then I'll come to Katharine, if that's okay.
I think it's really important that we go back to the best interest of the child that's enshrined within the Children Act as well, 1989. And I think it's really important, again, as a committee to consider the focus is on children first and absolutely disabled children as well. So I would have concerns about going down separate track routes in terms of legislation for disabled children. I think what we need to be doing is improving the leadership and the practice at an integrated level. This is not just about social care. This is about health. This is about community and voluntary sector. It's about the investment in those local services. It's about investment in advocacy services. And that comes with a charge. That comes with a cost packet. And within the independent review of children's social care, we know there was a recommendation of an investment of 2.6 billion. There has been investment, however, it falls sharp fall of that amount of money. And it's not acceptable. If we're really going to put children first, and disabled children and their parents and carers, we need to make sure that it's a system that has investment and that there's an investment also in the workforce. And I absolutely hear what you're saying in terms of the training for social workers as well. But we need to invest in training also at the point of them starting their career framework, and that's the student social workers. It's about investment in social work bursaries. And I can't emphasise enough that this is, I truly do not believe this is just about statutory framework. This is about best practice, it's about leadership, and it's about place. It's about real investment in support services at place level and making services accessible to residents in communities and certainly parents and carers of disabled children.
Maris, can I just ask you to address specifically the feedback from parents' organisations that parents of disabled children feel that they are being viewed by social workers through a lens of child protection? That's not an issue about funding, it's not an issue about frameworks, it's an issue about practice, and surely that should never be happening.
Absolutely, but what I'd be saying is within the context of that work environment, currently I think last year there was 630,000 referrals that came in to social care. There is something within the culture of supervision and reflective supervision within the workplace, and social workers do not have the time currently. We are hearing time and time again from social workers about high casework, about stress, about burnout. And I think in terms of the focus being on child protection and safeguarding, when that should not be the case, that's about reflection. That's actually somebody saying, why are you focusing on that? And actually looking at the framework for thresholds and people getting access in the system.
Thank you. Katharine.
I was just going to add, I think, we shouldn't overlook the huge overlap there is between children in the care system and disability as well. So children in care are far more likely to have a special educational need than children not in care. And they don't always have someone there who is advocating for them. We've heard about some of the challenges in the workforce, the turnover of professionals, not knowing those children. So not having that kind of the stability of a parent carer who can advocate for them to make sure that they get the support that they need. You also heard from the earlier panel about instability within the care system, and you discussed the issue of distance placements, and we know children with those more complex needs are more likely to be placed further from home. They're more likely to face multiple changes in their homes and in where they're living, and that makes it even harder for them to access support. It means there's challenges around the continuity of support that they might be accessing, and simply that there are professionals around them who don't know them and don't know their needs as well. So it's a big challenge, and I think it's important that we recognise that over half of children in care have a special educational need. So that sometimes we talk about these things in isolation, and I think it's important to recognise their particular challenges for disabled children in the care system.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to Mark now for your question.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for your answers so far. We know that there are shortages of staff across the sector, across everywhere, and we know that pay and workload often come up. So by all means, reference pay and workload in your answers, but I'll be interested in other things too. What measures do you think are needed to deal with the shortages of staff, and specifically across, social workers, disabled children's care workforce, and residential care home workers? What do we need to do? This is open to anyone to start.
I think the shortage and the turnover of staff is a huge issue, and I'm sure you'll hear more from colleagues about that. From children and young people's perspective, what they tell us is that constant having to rebuild relationships, that revolving door of professionals who make huge decisions about their life, and having to tell their story repeatedly is a massive, massive challenge. I just wanted to add to your list of workforce professionals, personal advisors, because they're often overlooked. So these are the professionals who support young people from care into more independent living when they're leaving care. There's very little training for those professionals. There's no statutory training, there's no statutory qualification, and what we hear from young people is that personal advisors can be an absolutely key and brilliant support in helping them make that transition into adulthood, and they can also have a very poor understanding and not offer much support at all. So there's huge variance, and I think they're a really, really key role that we often don't focus on very much. So I think in thinking about workforce, we need to think about personal advisors as well as challenges around other professionals in the workforce.
Oh, thank you.
That's very similar in early intervention as well. These roles that bring communities together, like the portage scheme, for example, families resonate all the time and say that it's so critical having those people to linchpin together and help them navigate the service, apply for the right benefits, support them with the EHC process, and just even understanding some of the forms is so helpful. I just add on that as a not-for-profit provider as well. I know you said no paying wet load, but the significant challenges that the sector's facing with national insurance increases as well. Just from a sense perspective, the combination of things announced in the budget with the national living wage too, we're facing a £5 million increase next year. So that's going to have a knock-on impact for social care. More for us, it's within our adult social care provision, but we shouldn't be looking at these things as adults and children either. And that's also a significant issue, is the disconnect between adults and children's from a provider and workforce perspective. In terms of our charity staff and recruitment, I think the big thing we would emphasise is the lack of specialists as well. So for us, it's multisensory impairment specialists in local areas. There is a recommendation that every local authority should have one, but our research found that half of local authorities don't. For children who are deaf-blind, this is literally the difference between them having the support to access the world around them. So it's also that specialism and that training as well, particularly for the people in the highest need groups.
I think as a starting point for me, it's also about the promotion and the value of social work and social care, and that goes across the sector in all areas of work. And I think there is such a negative image at the moment and messaging and narrative that it's actually putting people off from going into this career, and I mean a career in the broadest sense, both at a community level, from a social care practitioner level, residential services, support services. And I would really call out to committee to look at how that messaging can change and the message and value of social work and the contribution that it makes. I also think there's a really important opportunity here in terms of the mission pillars of government and looking at opportunity. How can we encourage the next generation of workers in all of these aspects to actually see this as a career that is really valued and can support them in employment? And that's something we need to look at. And young people themselves who may have experienced disabilities, who have got special educational needs, how do we support those people to enter this career market as well? I also would call for more investment in terms of training and development. And I think the comment from Harriet earlier was just spot on. We used to have welfare advisors in so many community-based services. Welfare advisors used to be part of social work structures. They would support families and vulnerable people to access the services that they need and the benefits they need. Most of those roles have gone. So I would also call back for that. And finally, the mobility between practitioners. So we have social workers and social care practitioners in adult services that want to move to children's services and vice versa. But we are starting to see the separation of children's services and adult services, and that's not good for families and it's not good for practitioners. Thank you.
We go to Patrick.
I'm just going to ask a quick question predominantly towards Maris about, on the back of this conversation, which is, to what extent do you recognise a statement that practitioners currently operate in a climate of risk aversion and fear of getting something wrong?
I think that's a very fair comment. I think they do in some areas. And I think that's, again, partly linked to media coverage. I think it's about a process structure. Sorry.
It's okay. We can carry on.
Okay. It's about a process structure in terms of things become process-driven. Complete the assessment, tick the box. And there is less of a focus in terms of reflective practice. But reflective practice comes with time. And I can't emphasise enough today the importance of social workers having time to develop sustainable relationships with the children and families that they work with, and parents and carers. And currently they do not have that. So they are reverting back to a process-driven model of service delivery. And I think that's cascaded down. I think it's influenced by inspection regimes that become tick-box driven in many instances, and the pressure, not just within social work and social care, but across the board, the pressure to respond to queries and responses from some of that may also include, for example, elected members, and it's how do we actually move away from an administration process and return back to a professional practice-based approach.
You wanted to come in for
I think when we're talking about risk averse, I think the impact of that on parents is that we operate at a deficit model. We're not operating at that person-centred approach, and I think this is where parents feel that they are then viewed through a safeguarding lens, because we're not understanding the dynamics of the family. We are going through that tick box process-driven way of managing things, rather than taking a step back, analysing the family, the child, the dynamics, and understanding the needs and dealing with that on an individual basis. I don't think that we celebrate the strengths that families have and celebrate the strengths that the social work can bring to that family and how we can push them forward. We certainly don't have neuro-affirming practices within our, and I think as a growing demographic, it's really important that we have better understanding of differences. And I think that, as you've mentioned, early intervention is key, and we think of social care as that crisis level, but actually if we're not providing really good signposting, quality information and specialist staff before that, we are creating a funnel where we are just moving people into that deficit model of safeguarding, and social care is seen at the top end rather than universally.
Caroline.
I just wanted to ask a quick question about what Harriet said, if you would, about, I was struck by the scale of the figure of £5 million for your charity, if I heard correctly, extra because of the budget. What sort of, do you expect to be able to raise that money from extra donations, or do you expect to reduce your headcount of your charity? Do you expect to reduce the services delivered to children? What gives it with that sort of sum of money?
Well, we're really worried, and a lot of other charities in the sector are as well. There's a recent report this week that's just come out showing how vast the impact is on the not-for-profit sector. No, we don't expect to be able to raise that. Charities don't have that surplus in the services that we're delivering. We're not like profit providers where we have that room, we can just pay for profit with it. A lot of this work is local authority funded, so it's going to be a knock-on impact. We're going to be having to raise our funds through commissioning, and we're not optimistic that that's going to be available from the money that was provided in the budget. So we're hoping that, having a lot of conversations about this, there's a lot being talked about with government at the moment, so there is something that needs to happen here. And from our perspective, it's looking at funding in the round. We are delivering statutory contracts. It's just taking from one, giving to another at this point in time, and it will impact on disabled children and disabled adults. And it's about personalised support, isn't it? It's commissioning services based on what people need, not on how much it costs or trying to put people into shoestring budgets. So, but I can send you a detailed breakdown as well of what that looks like.
That's really interesting. Essentially, what you seem to be saying is that without some change in government policy, your charity is going to be able to deliver less services, fewer services to deaf and blind children.
And that's what the report this week showed from VOJ, which is the Coalition for Voluntary Sector Providers. And a significant amount of us are looking at ways that we can cut this, and it would probably come down to having to close services in many cases.
Mark?
Yeah, no, it's just a brief follow-up from my original question, because Katharine, you quite rightly highlighted that the 3 examples I gave didn't cover the entire workforce. And then Maris, you came in with, you need to value social care more. I talked about pay and workload, and I'm looking for any other specific measures we can take to retain and recruit social care workers. For example, we know that the student bursaries have been frozen for 8 years. Is that something that we should unlock to get more staff into the sector? I just wanted to come back and see if there's any other measures that I've missed out on.
Certainly student bursaries, but also a redesign in terms of the way that teams are actually structured. I'm not talking from a child protection, children need perspective here, but the actual numbers of families, children and families that social workers and social care staff work with. And that's going to be a big investment, and it's going to be about, again, allocating time and quality to build relationships with families. As I say, it really is about time. And when we receive phone calls from social workers who are talking about caseloads of 28 young people that they're working with, high levels of child protection, children in need within the system, and going back to the earlier point, what then happens in terms of who gets that service at what given time. And it comes back to thresholds, and it comes back to risk and managing risk. And we have really good examples also of many social workers and social work leaders that are managing risk well. Social workers are operating 7 days a week, morning, noon and night. And I'd say it is about reinvestment in terms of that workforce. And the pay and parity, social workers and social care workers do not get the same pay standards as, for example, our colleagues in health. There is something here about equal value, and we've got to really start investing in the workforce, because ultimately we need to make sure we get the best for children and families, and that will happen from an effective workforce. And just finally on this point, one example is there is funding currently for Oliver McGowan training. That funding funnel is coming through the NHS. I'm speaking to colleagues in social work who cannot access that training because the funding is coming through and it's ring-fenced for NHS workers. And I would really call for an integrated funding pot for continuous professional development for staff and for community organisations as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to move us on to Amanda's question.
Thank you. We've heard around thresholds and risks with regards to interventions. And the spending, we heard in our previous committee that spending previously has shifted away from early intervention across years. The current government's proposals to strengthen early help through multi-agency safeguarding arrangements and family group decision making, do you think that will make a difference?
I'd just say this is a really good example where disabled children haven't been put at the forefront of a lot of the proposals that have been put forward. Really value a lot of what's been said by the government around early intervention, around strengthening the system. The Law Commission review is incredibly welcome, and they've been really great at engaging parent carers. But yet again, in the rhetoric all the time, disabled children and the high quality support of social care, or the vision for social care and what it can actually do to change people's lives, it's a different narrative. You know, it comes from safeguarding and child protection. So that also changes the way that charities like ours and parent carers see themselves within this system. They often don't think of themselves, they probably don't see themselves in what you've just said, I would imagine. And at the very worst end of it, we hear from families that are actually told they're above a threshold for social care support, and in fact their needs are too high, and it becomes a battle between health and social care, who's going to pay for them. And a lot of the time we're told by these families they just end up backing away, because if they don't back away, they're then put at risk of safeguarding. They're told, if we can't support you, this is clearly a child protection issue. So this is really scary and worrying, because actually the families you're hearing from are probably not the worst stories. The worst ones are the people that don't have time and capacity to come forward. They don't have the skills, the knowledge, they don't know what they're entitled to. And also they're under legal, they're amongst legal decisions at the moment. A lot of the people that we speak to and get their stories out in the media, we can't use them if they've got legal cases ongoing, so actually you don't hear the worst of it.
I think as well there's a real growing risk of, if you're pushing, if there's that distinction between health and social care, that we are seeing a growing number of parents and carers being concerned that are fabricated of illnesses, and that is becoming again that parent blaming lens, that you must go on a parenting course because that will fix all of your woes. Your child's behaviour must be your fault, or we can't see that, so it can't exist. And we look at masking. We've as an education, we've moved through. We now accept masking is there and it's different, and children can be perceived differently in different environments, but we still don't have that. I think wider, and there really is a huge difference in how we focus. Like we don't come into social care as it seems to be a very detrimental focus, rather than coming in it with a positive view and how can we help, and it doesn't have that early intervention viewpoint, I don't think.
So in other words, you're saying it's not just about the shift of more balance of funding towards intervention, it is also about the narrative that runs alongside that.
Yeah, I think so. I think you've got to have a really positive narrative, and I think you've got to build a culture where people feel that they can go to social care to get help, rather than feel if they go to social care they are going to have their child taken away. And that, sadly, is what many people have. And what that then does mean is that the early intervention isn't either provided or available, or parents aren't signposted, and then needs escalate, which then sadly costs more for more to resolve, but also then impacts on the child and young person's outcome and that family outcome, and that's when we see families breaking down. And I think that we need to build a culture where people feel social care is the place to come and they can get the appropriate advice and support without being put through that safeguarding lens.
People just don't understand what it means, and I just wanted to just say as well, when it works well, it's transformative, and it's amazing. It's the difference between disabled children making friends, it's them playing, it's having a break in the summer holidays, it's parents having just 10 minutes at the weekend extra to be able to look after themselves. So it's really important, and 10 minutes doesn't sound a lot, but that's the reality for a lot of parents, isn't it, anyway? But yeah, so I just wanted to put it out there that that's the narrative we should be entrenching in these reforms.
We've got Katharine who's wanting to come in, I think, and then I'll come to you.
I guess just from a kind of children at risk of entering the care system perspective, like early intervention is absolutely key, and we know there's been a shift, and you heard from the last panel, in spending to late intervention versus early intervention. So it's really important that we look at what support is there for families to help them earlier before those issues escalate and children are removed into the care system. So I think that undoubtedly is part of the piece. I think one of the earlier panellists said about double spending. We can't just reset the system, because there are children who will need support within the care system now, and who are getting a very poor deal often. So we need to do that, as well as look at those early intervention measures, which hopefully in time will mean fewer children enter the care system, but that's not going to happen overnight. And then just the other point to make is the issue of poverty. All the early intervention and support in the world doesn't negate the effect of poverty on the numbers of children entering the care system. There's very clear evidence that increases in poverty lead to increases in children entering care. So early support and early intervention, yes, but also supporting those children who do go into the care system, and thinking about the impact of poverty on families as well.
Yeah, and just to reinforce what Katharine said, certainly from the poverty perspective, but it is about a whole system approach, and we would fully support investment in early help and family group decisions. That is integral, and I think in many instances there is a network of support that can be enabled to help children at a local place level and within families. And we would certainly support the development and the investment in community-based resources, and some of the examples that we've heard from Harriet today. But it is part of a continuum. and there are some children who do need to access other forms of support from social work and social care. So it's making sure that we have the balance in terms of financial investment and the time to develop those really important relationships, both with children and families.
Bring Patrick in and then Caroline.
Fantastic.
Sorry.
It was just a very quick point, and just reliant on those community services. We do see a huge shift between commissioned providers directing people through to the voluntary sector, which is great because a lot of that is peer-led. They have some wonderful support and provision. However, most of these are unfunded and rely on either local authority funding, local ICB funding, which we know is now is tightening, and so we're seeing a lot of these organisations closing their gaps because they don't have the funding or the volunteer workforce to deliver these much needed services. And I think the more restriction we place around how we fund our local community provisions will impact wider because they are the first line of defence, and if we're not funding or investing and valuing our community services, we will see an impact with more demand for statutory and commissioned provision.
Thank you. I just wanted to touch on good quality early intervention. Joe, I believe you made a point about parenting classes and support for parents being stigmatising, which is disappointing to hear because it shouldn't be. Can you give us an idea, all four people on the panel, would you be able to give me an idea of, the committee an idea of what good early intervention programmes look like, and specific examples of which programmes out there do you think should be expanded and scaled up?
So there are some brilliant parenting support initiatives, and I think that where parenting programmes become an issue is where they're used as a barrier for support. So you can only access this support if you've gone on this 12-week programme, and that 12-week programme often, can I name a programme? Is that
yeah.
I don't want to. So there'll be programmes, things like Triple P. It's a parenting programme, but it is aimed at children who are not necessarily neurodiverse. So if I'm going to go on a parenting programme and you're going to teach me all wonderful things about how to raise my children, but none of that is relevant because my child has got autism, high anxiety, and you're not going to give me the tools, that parenting programme might be lovely, but it's not going to support my understanding and how to meet my child's needs. So I think it's about, if we're going to use parenting programmes, they should be done alongside the support. And I think if you look at the guidance that came out for the autism pathways last year, it talks about the damage that can be led if we are putting barriers in place before early intervention. They are useful and they can be useful, but we need to be investing in programmes that support neurodevelopment in particular. So, you know, if you're going to go on a parenting course, you've got to teach people about how to parent a child with autism, how to educate them, how to understand them. But also we need to be empowering them, things like sensory needs. We need to be empowering parents to understand children's needs so they can flex. If I go and get told if your child is having a meltdown, if you put them on a bouncy ball for 10 minutes, they'll calm down. Well, that's great, but actually next week they might want to swing, and the week after that they might need to stand upside down, and the week after that they might need to rock. So I need someone to tell me how to empower me to understand my child and how I can meet their needs so that I can then recognise what they need to do. And that's what we need to do. We need to be empowering parents to support their children, not putting them in a box saying you can't get any other support unless you've done this programme, but that programme doesn't meet those child's needs. And I think most of all, it's advice and support. You know, we have lots of parenting books. No one comes onto the world and has a book about how to raise a child. Every child is different. But we need people to signpost and understand. And you've got the local offers, which are great. If you can go onto your own local offer, and I challenge you to go and find your own local offer and find a provision. And if you can find that without going through 10 different pages on that website, which will all tell you that they can't help you, I would be very surprised. Because often you're given a whole list of websites and you have to go all the way through them, and most of it you'll get is your child doesn't meet criteria, or you'll go through the phone call, you put in the email and you'll wait and you'll come back and say, we don't really, you've got any HCP so we can't help you. So we need really clear advice, we need communication, and we need to understand what access criteria is, and we need it presented in a really communicative way. And having people that can help us navigate that is really useful.
Absolutely. Echo all of those things. And I think we hear time and again peer-led support is really transformative at that early stage, and that's been shown also in the Disabled Children's Partnership report around specifically for ethnic communities, that they really benefited from talking to people in their own communities with similar backgrounds as well. Being a parent carer can be a really lonely journey. You've gone through probably quite a lot of trauma at this stage, in a very difficult time of life for parents anyway when you've got small babies. So having that peer network cannot be understated. That's really valuable for people. We run an early intervention programme at Sense, and we hear from parents all the time how valuable this is, but we can only work in the areas where we can get the funding for it. So we'd love it to be bigger, but at the moment it's really very patchy in terms of funding available for services. And I think, as Jo said, specialist support for disabled children need. They're not one group. There's huge diversity within that label, and so having that specialism, having those services commissioned in a way that works with children with different needs is really important. So multisensory impairment would be an example of that. They're going to have very different needs, and those parents will need different skills for life, like sign language, like Makaton, for example, that other parents would not necessarily need as much. And I think I just also, the partnership model within local areas is when we see it working really well. So partnerships with charities, with the local authority, where there's those pathways, where there's that ease of access. In some areas it does work really well, but it's often where you've got kind of leading, passionate people in maybe social services, maybe it's in the hospital, but they really have made an effort to make themselves really connected and champions for disabled children.
I'm just coming in. I also think good models are about in-person contact, and too often we hear of parents and family members who are really struggling to speak to a person, honestly. They're making contact with an organisation, and it's press 1, it's press 2, it's listen to music, and good models are about the right time, being able to make the right access and speak to a person, and again have the time to be listened to and the flexibility. People are talking to us about wanting 24/7 contact numbers. I think that's a really good model. At 10 o'clock at night, when a parent or a family, a young person is really struggling, where is the support outside of a statutory service? How can we be creative and dynamic about those preventative services? And I think there are models of good practice, certainly within the voluntary and community sector. And I have direct experience of working in an early help model that included workers from disabled services, from substance misuse services, welfare advice, benefit advisors, as well as social care. And that's the type of integrated model, and health workers, where it's the first point of contact, where people are not having to repeat their story. You know, people can sit down and really talk about their child and the young person, and you're actually working with that child and young person. And that's what good models of practice are about. It's about relationship-based practice.
I'm going to have to move us on because we're running tight on time. We've got some other important questions that we want to get through. Caroline, you had indicated, do you really need to come in on this one?
Just a very quick question, actually, related to what Patrick's just asked and what Jo said about parenting classes. We know that in some cases they can be very effective at helping with children that have a challenging behaviour. So how do we change that narrative from being a culture of fear that a parent is being told they're not doing things correctly to an empowering parents to do things in perhaps a different way, to offer them different options, so we have a different sort of culture towards it?
I think it's the communication, and I think that's key. I think it's also the communication that's being delivered and the narrative around that. You can have the same course delivered by two different people, but if you've got a very different lens being delivered by those two different people, it's going to come across. But also I think the main thing is they shouldn't be used as a barrier to access other services. So I think that is where it comes in, is, well, you must go on this course, and it's not specific for those child's needs, and you can't do a course for every different child's needs. But there are national things like SENSE. If you've got physical, if you've got a sight impairment, then that would be a really good place to go and help them, and they would be able to talk to you about how you can communicate with your child and young person, which is going to support their behavioural needs, and you can support them effectively. But you wouldn't send a child that has got sight and hearing impairment. You wouldn't ask that parent to go to a course that isn't going to give them any support around that. So it's the same with a child that has got autism or ADHD. Those disabilities might not be as visible, but they still have different behaviours that need different types of support. So you've got to provide the right support at these courses.
I'm going to move us on. I'm afraid we've got important topic areas we haven't covered at all yet. So I'm going to go to Serena's question. If that
Thank you. My question is to Maris and Katharine on reunification. The previous committee heard evidence stating that reunification for children in care with their families is often not at the focus that it needs to be in children's social care. Do you agree?
Yes, I think in short, we know that a large proportion of children in care will go back to their birth families. It's about a quarter will go back to their birth families, but that a significant proportion of those children will then return to the care system within 6 years because that reunification hasn't worked. Often what can happen is there's a lot of focus on the family until a child goes into care, and then it stops, and then the child will be returned, and there's been no work, no support done with that family in the intervening period. So there needs to be a much more concentrated effort to make sure that where it's possible, reunification works, because otherwise it's just a whole heap of extra instability for that child and also for the family.
Yeah, I'd agree as well. I don't think there is enough time and investment, again, in that particular area of work. And being absolutely honest to the committee, I think because of the pressure in many local authorities and with thresholds, once a child is in an alternative place of permanency, even for an interim period of time, I think sometimes it's, right, how can we work with the next child coming in the system? And I'm being really honest about that. So I think there does need to be investment. I think there needs to be, in some areas there do need to be specialist teams as well as generic teams, and I think there needs to be a focus on this area of work. For some children and young people, I think we also need to be honest, sometimes it's very difficult for complex reasons for some children to move back in terms of their families, but for the most part we would actively be supporting reunification, and again investment in terms of teams and structures within local authorities and organisations. And it's not just the child and family, it's the support around that child and family when that young person returns home, what services are available within the community, and what's going to be the long-term support. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Leaving care, this is a question for Katharine and Maris primarily. So leaving care can feel like walking towards a cliff edge for many young people. What are your views on the government's proposed measures to support care leavers, in particular the extension of the staying close support?
So you're right, it is a massive cliff edge. We know that 1 in 3 young people leaving care become homeless within 2 years of leaving care. There's been a significant increase in the rates of homelessness amongst young care leavers over the last 5 years. So it's an area that absolutely needs attention. We think the extension of staying close is a step in the right direction. It will be for young people up to 25, and it will cover children in both foster care as well as residential and other settings, so that's welcome. I think some of the limitations and concerns that we would have is that it places a duty on the local authority to assess whether a child might need a package of support, and we know that when those discretionary elements are kind of baked in, that often that means that a lot of young people who need that support are not going to get it, and given the kind of sufficiency challenges facing councils at the moment, we think that threshold is concerning. We also know that there's an issue around young people being aware and able to access their rights and entitlements, so a question about how that would work with the expansion, and also what would that package of support contain. You know, what are the minimum standards around that? Are we likely to see very variable levels and quality of the support provided? So step in the right direction, but we think there's some issues that need addressing there.
Nice.
Yeah, fully endorse with what's just been said, and also we'd probably go a step further, that we also think that there needs to be a review in terms of the Equality Act, and for children in care to become a protected characteristic, and that's not just while that young person is in the care system, but post. We know that many young people in care, as well as many children, suffer from issues of discrimination, issues of racism, oppression, poverty, poor housing, and particularly for vulnerable people, young people who've been in the care system. We know there's a higher rate of young people who've been in care in the prison system. You know, this has got to be addressed, and certainly rough sleepers as well, and people who do not get access to the support and housing that they should at a place level. So we would certainly support it, but also look at how we can strengthen statute in supporting people who've been in the care system as a protected characteristic. Thank you.
I mean, I think on the issue of protected characteristic, and I should caveat, it isn't an area that we've done a huge amount of work on, but I think there are a few things that need looking at. So one is the kind of calls which are growing within the care experience community for it to be a protected characteristic. I think we do need to look at those and also understand where there are some concerns, because there are some mixed views there, but it seems to be there's broadly support, so I think that needs to be looked at. The second is understanding where those councils have voluntarily opted to make care a protected characteristic without a legal change. What are the kind of changes? What's the good practice there? And the third thing is, I think, just being clear about what equalities legislation can achieve and what it's unlikely to achieve. So it can tackle issues around discrimination, you know, better data collection, impact assessments and so on. Will it end the care cliff? I'm not sure, and I think we just need to understand what it might achieve, but also the other changes that are needed. So it's not an either or. It's not that protected characteristic would solve all the problems within the care system, but it might bring some advantages. So I just think there needs to be a clear debate about what it could do and what some of those limitations are, because it won't solve everything. That's
not a silver bullet.
It's not a silver bullet.
No. Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, I just wanted to ask what further measures you would like to see improve support for care leavers, and would you be in favour of a national offer for care leavers?
I mean, yes, I think so. We'd like to see the extension of staying put as well, so enabling young people to stay with their foster families where that's an option. We'd like to see both staying close and staying put be opt-out legal entitlements up to the age of 25. Young people leaving care get a lower rate of universal credit. It's about £20 a week lower than over 25s, like all under 25s do, and it's kind of predicated on having family support. Often young people leaving care don't have that family support, so we think they should be entitled to the over 25 rates of universal credit. Corporate parenting, which the government has said they will expand those duties to a range of public bodies. There needs to be proper accountability around that, and we need to see changes to the homelessness legislation to tighten the safety net and also to make sure that there's proper housing support for all young people leaving the care system.
Aaron.
Thank you. Very quickly, there are a few members looking at possibly an APPG on care leaving as a protected characteristic, so it'd be good to carry on that conversation outside. But my actual question is on, in terms of the best practice, we're talking very much about policy, but at the best practice, where should we be looking for successful care leaving offers and experiences and processes, be it in this country or internationally?
I mean, I think we could definitely come back on specifics around local authority areas. I think there are good schemes. Staying close and staying put are good schemes, and they're showing real promises, and there's evidence they're reducing the levels of homelessness amongst young people leaving care. So where we know things work, it's also about making sure that we roll those out so that young people are entitled to them. I think we can also learn where things aren't working as well. So, for example, the expansion of corporate parenting, brilliant, great initiative. It's already happening in Scotland, but the issue in Scotland is that it's lacking kind of teeth and accountability. So while there's some brilliant practice, for example, in the university sector, other public bodies are not kind of doing what they should, and there's a risk that what's going to happen now in England is also not going to have the levels of accountability that we'd like to see. So corporate parenting bodies will only need to report every 3 years. It will be kind of marking their own homework. What more can we do? There's a good measure there that could have some teeth. How do we give it teeth? And we're hoping that it will be brought forward as part of the discussion around the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill.
Yes.
So yes, just finally, are there any further areas of the DfE's recent policy paper, Keeping Children Safe, that we haven't discussed, which you'd like to respond to?
Very briefly, I know that with the previous panel you spoke about distance placements. That's an issue that Become's been looking at a lot. It is a growing problem, and I think it really needs addressing. Welcome steps in the paper. There's more that needs to be done around looking at sufficiency within the care system nationally.
Yes, Jess, I'd like to come back on that. I think certainly tackling the profiteering of out-of-borough placements and care provider placements across the market, including fostering agencies, I think is something really welcome, and it's just absolutely abhorrent to think that profits are being made from the vulnerabilities of children and young people, so we fully support that action. Maybe it doesn't go far enough. We're also concerned about sometimes wholesale project teams that may go into local authorities at very high cost, so we would welcome that also being scrutinised. In terms of broader issues as well, we don't think there's enough of a focus in terms of anti-racism and anti-oppressive practice and anti-discriminatory practice within all of the proposals, and we'd like to explore that being strengthened in terms of core principles. And finally, as one of the enablers, I think it's really important that there's a revisit of the workforce and the conditions of social workers and social care staff, and it needs to be a standalone enabler. Thank you.
I just add for disabled children, and I think there's been big gap around holiday provision, and we haven't really spoken about short breaks, and we saw that in the paper as well from DFE. There's the Short Breaks Innovation Fund is due to end in April next year, and there's nothing come out from government on it. This is a fund that has really enabled some local authorities to provide and really spearhead holidays, but in a lot of areas it's just a desert for holiday provision. In some areas there's nothing disabled children can access in the summer holidays, and similar for wraparound care, it just doesn't work for disabled children. So a lot of what's in that paper is just actually a bit irrelevant. Breakfast clubs, for example, universal breakfast clubs is so far away for disabled children, they can't even get into the ones at the moment that so there's a real lens missing, we thought, in the DFE paper. Also just want to add on data and evidence. We really welcome the unique identifier idea. There's such a gap in any granularity of data on disability. So how are you meant to have intelligent service design? How are providers meant to, how are social workers meant to know what that local area needs if the data is just not there? So we do think that could be really transformative in helping unpack that.
Just one thing in relation to short breaks, which is a brilliant opportunity for many children and young people, where we are seeing delays with pathways for children and young people to access diagnosis. Many of these services are diagnosis-led, so where there might be a 2 or 3 year delay to get a diagnosis of autism, many of these children and young people then can't access the facilities that short breaks offer. So that's something also to consider. And the innovation funds were great because a lot of them then expanded to have those that are who are waiting on a pathway but are unable to do that on a long-term basis.
Just one final very brief point. I would not overlook the issue of children being in care being placed in supported accommodation. There's been a big growth in the use of supported accommodation, which is often not appropriate for young people, and also, you touched on it earlier, but unregistered illegal homes, and I think both of those areas need attention.
Thank you. Just wanted to ask one really quick final question, I think mainly for Maris. So just reflecting on the very high profile case that we have in the media at the moment, which raises many questions about child protection and other serious cases that we have had in recent living memory. You've been calling in the evidence today for a shift from a very kind of process-driven accountability model for social work to a more kind of, can we just get back to professional practice and trust social workers? And we obviously can see some of the pitfalls with the model as it is at the moment in terms of workload and so forth. But can I just ask where accountability comes? So in the minds of kind of, the general public and everywhere, is that, these cases where we have clear evidence of failures in practice, where children have been seen by services, known to services, and that they still end up with the very, very serious harm coming to them. In a different model, where is the accountability in that approach?
Safeguarding is everybody's agenda. I'm absolutely clear about that. And that's across different organisations, including social work, social care, health, the police, voluntary and community sector, and often there can be place-based local intelligence where neighbours, people in the community have heard things that are happening to a particular child or young person. It's how we really focus on citizenship and safeguarding becoming collectively everybody's agenda. In terms of accountability, it is an integrated perspective in terms of accountability. There's no doubt about that. And I think there is far too much blame, and sadly it's happening again, and we do need to talk about it, where an individual social worker or a specific practitioner will be named in the press, and it doesn't look at the granular detail until we're actually focused on the review and government reviews. So the accountability is at a place level, it's across an integrated organisational level, and certainly at a national level. And if mistakes have happened and there are concerns about competency or capacity, that needs to be addressed at an organisational level. And too often it is about time. And I know I've repeated that a lot today, but honestly, we are hearing of people dealing with far too much work, dreading coming into work, not sleeping at night because they're worried about the children, the young people on their caseload. So the accountability, it has to happen at a system leadership level as well as a practitioner level in terms of their discussions and ongoing reflective practice with their social work managers.
Thank you very much. Can I thank all of our witnesses for coming to give your evidence to us today. Thank members for your questions as well. That brings our session to an end. Order. Thank you.
Thank you.